Hello and welcome to a new video. The Core 2 Quad Q9650 is a quad-core Intel CPU from 12 years back. By default, it is clocked at 3 GHz, but I've clocked it to 4 GHz for these benchmarks. This CPU has been praised for good gaming performance, despite being very old by now. I got one for free and was interested about its performance in modern titles, so I tested it with 5 different games. Here you can see all my testing hardware. So, in addition to the CPU, I'm using an RX 480 for a graphics card, 8 gigs of memory in 2 4 gig sticks. Windows 10 is installed on an SSD. Cyberpunk is installed on SSD, but other games are on HDD. Our first game is CSGO, which is known to be a quite easy to run esports title. This CPU needed to be overclocked to 4 GHz to run this game well enough, but clocked at 4 GHz it is playable. However, the lowest settings needed to be enabled for this game to run, so that sure isn't a good sign when CSGO runs just barely. And while testing games, I noticed that performance isn't the only issue with this CPU. It lacks some instruction sets required for some modern games, such as supplemental SSE 3. For this reason, Apex Legends does not run on this CPU. For some games, third-party patches exist that make the games playable on these CPUs that would be otherwise unsupported, but for Apex Legends, a fix for Intel CPUs is not available currently, if I understand correctly. Grand Theft Auto 5 Online is not a very heavy game to run. The online usually has 20 or something less FPS than GTA5 would normally have, especially with these older CPUs. With these quite high settings, it seemed promising that the game was able to run in around 40 FPS. However, when trying to reach 60 FPS by setting everything lower, it's disappointing to notice that the FPS doesn't really get higher, because the game seemed to be CPU bound all the time, so this is just taking off GPU load. Despite not being 60 FPS, the frames are very consistent and it feels way higher than somewhat around 40 FPS. So the game is very playable. we have Cyberpunk 2077 here, and as you can see I've set everything to lowest and it's running at 1080p resolution like all the other games I tested. Before this video I saw other people's videos about testing Cyberpunk with their Core 2 Quad CPUs, and those seemed very promising. However, I'm only able to get under 20 FPS most of the time, so this game really isn't playable. At least the combat would be quite uncomfortable with this FPS. Cyberpunk is one of those games that would require CPU instruction sets that this CPU doesn't have, so it requires a third-party patch to launch the game. There are some optimization programs and INI files around the internet for Cyberpunk 2077 and older CPUs. I tried some of those, but I really didn't seem to gain much performance from those supposed optimizations. When driving, the FPS gets even lower, and this really can't be called playable, which is a shame because other benchmarks gave me hope that this game could be played with this CPU, but maybe I've done something wrong with applying the optimizations or something. Many of the other people benchmarking Cyberpunk on Core 2 Quads seem to do so with the starting tutorial mission in the countryside, and that performance there is maybe not representative of the performance in the night city where most of the game will be spent. Next, we have Fortnite at 1080p low settings. With Fortnite, this CPU performs otherwise passably, but it has some seemingly random stutters, especially at the start of the match here. The CPU usage is at 100% almost all of the time, so it's just looking that this CPU is having hard time running this game. So performance with Fortnite is a bit of a disappointment. It looks like this CPU loses to AMD Phenom 2 quad cores. The dips in FPS are especially irritating while in combat. In upcoming videos I'll be testing more games with more CPUs, especially Core 2 Duo and Core 2 Quad CPUs.